I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, we would like to thank the briefers today. Thank Miroslava Jenča, Ursula Muller, Ertugrul Apakan, and Martin Sajek for their briefings. Mr. President, we came up with the initiative to convene the meeting today with the purpose of discussing the implementation of the all-important document for the purposes of settling the in Ukrainian crisis, and it is the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. It was signed 4 years ago on the 12th of February 2015, signed by the representative of the OSCE, Ukraine, Russia, DNR, and LNR. We have every reason to raise this issue because this document is an integral part. It's an annex to the Security Council Resolution number 2202, dated 17th February 2015. And in its very first operative paragraph, this resolution endorses the package of measures. Furthermore, the support for the implementation of the package of measures is also reiterated in the Presidential Security Council statement of 6th June 2018. Some of our partners in the Security Council are, for some reason, under the illusion, not just on this topic, but on this topic in particular, they think that we're ill at ease when discussing the Ukrainian topic. This is not entirely correct. It's exactly the opposite. Quite to the contrary, we are more than anyone interested in making sure that the world entire hears about how the Western countries first staged an anti-state coup in that country and then provided Kiev with a license to do absolutely anything under the guise that there is a mythical Russian threat and aggression. On the 21st of February will be 5 years since the moment when, in the presence of high representatives of the European Union, Germany, Poland, and France, who were guarantors, the at the time president of the country, Yanukovych, signed an agreement with the opposition about the peacefully settling the crisis. And almost immediately thereafter, he was deceived and ultimately forced to leave Ukraine. And who knows? Maybe if he acted of the way the current Ukrainian authorities are acting, or the way the leaders of democratic countries are acting when they're not shy when using force against protesters, then Ukraine would not be plunged into a deep economic crisis, into lawlessness, and would not end up a commodities supplier of the European Union and a supplier of labor force. All the more so since the justification for doing that he had, and the protesters, as we know today for a fact, were armed, and they were intended to grab power using any, including bloody provocations. And ultimately, that's exactly what they did. I am describing this in detail to make sure that we understand that the West as a whole and the three guarantor countries bears direct responsibility for everything that took place and is taking place, as well as the United States, the real puppeteers of this Maidan theater, who today are encouraging and covering up any provocations by Kiev, including the recent one in the Black Sea, and readily provide weapons into this country, thus edging it towards reckless acts. Unfortunately, it's obvious for us that the West is not interested in the Ukraine at all, nor is it interested in its fate and the well-being of its people. Ukraine is of interest to them only insofar as it's a pawn in their geopolitical confrontation with Russia. It would seem that 4 years ago, the international community and parties to the Ukrainian conflict agreed about what the formula for the settlement should be. In May of 2018, in the course of a Security Council meeting, which was convened by our Polish colleagues, we dwelt in extreme detail on the Minsk package of measures. I'm not going to do that today, therefore. But in order to make sure that the document is something that you have in front of you, we decided to print out and disseminate the Security Council Resolution 2202. And I urge you every single time, please read this document carefully. Please do not repeat something that you learned by rote when you say that Russia has to implement the Minsk agreements. There is nothing about Russia here, not a word, and we have stated that more than once. This is absurd. when Kiev is sabotaging the Minsk agreements and people are trying to make Moscow pay the price for that. Let me make the point once again. All of the steps mentioned in the resolutions are in a given order following items 1 to 13 intentionally, and it is because the sequence of events is of key importance. Let me repeat that the implementation of item 9 about giving over to the Ukrainian side control of the border with Russia in Donetsk and Lugansk areas is only possible after all other items are implemented, and they include separating of forces and materiel, passing a law about the special status of Donbas, creating the self-government bodies on its basis, amnesty, exchanging the captured, etc. But today we unfortunately have every reason to say that the Minsk agreements is something that Kiev is consciously and sustainably is not implementing and sabotaging. And our Western partners are covering up all of these acts by Kiev. And the best illustration of that is the fact that on the 5th of February, the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine stated they were starting criminal prosecution of one of the leaders of Ukrainian opposition, Mr. Medvedchuk, who decided to run in the presidential election on the 31st of March. And the reason for this prosecution is because he is urging something that is in the Minsk package of measures, namely a direct dialogue between Kiev and Donbas and providing that region with a special status within Ukraine. In other words, implementing the Minsk agreements in Ukraine is something that is tantamount to treason and is subject to criminal prosecution. The agreement in the Minsk document says that there's a need for direct dialogue with the authorities in Lugansk and Donetsk, and this is something that gives rise to an allergic reaction in Kiev. Now, our Western colleagues pretend they don't notice that, and this way they're using their double standard. Why am I saying that this is a double standard? Because in all other conflicts on Security Council agenda, we all together are trying to put the fighting parties to the negotiating table to make sure that the confrontation is stopped or hostilities are stopped and the political process is begun. Let's recall Syria. So what is the proverbial story of our efforts here? Absolutely correct if you think that it's creating a constitutional committee with the participation of the government and opposition and arriving at agreements on the basis of a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. Let's recall Yemen. We all applauded the Stockholm agreements between the government of Yemen and Ansar Allah. Whereas today you and us as well are keeping our fingers crossed, hoping that these fragile agreements be implemented. We all welcome the Khartoum agreements on the Central African Republic. The goal there was reconciling something that was once irreconcilable. The goal of any peacekeeping process, and you're not going to argue with this, I'm sure, is to arrive at a political rather than a military resolution of conflict through direct negotiations between conflicting sides. Why should the situation be different in Ukraine? Why are you not trying to make sure that Kiev agrees finally to sit down at a negotiating table with a direct participant in the conflict and tell us with your worn out, hackneyed expressions telling us the Russians should do this, should do that, should do the other? Don't trouble yourself. I'll answer that question myself, especially since you will not bother. This is because you are satisfied with the paradigm, disingenuous paradigm pursued by the Kiev authorities when they say this is not a civilian conflict, this is war with Russia. And war, as we all know, can write off a lot, and that's exactly what President Poroshenko is doing. All of the woes of Ukraine, not just recently, but in the last 3 centuries, are the consequence, according to him, of the occupation of Ukraine by Russia. And this paradigm, this false paradigm in Ukraine is being used in order to create new false history, which consists of putting together skeletons taken out of closets. This is a paradigm that allows Kievan authorities not to agree on anything, because according to them, a party to the conflict is not her own citizens, but the aggressive country. Accordingly, the Minsk agreements is something that can be thrown out. And that is exactly what the Ukrainian authorities did. In such a false paradigm with their own citizens, people who live in Donetsk and Luhansk, when you don't have to talk to them. But the people who live in Donetsk and Luhansk, for some reason, do not notice an aggressor in their midst and do not protest against their actual authorities and are not begging Kiev to save them. But Kiev can then continue shedding crocodile tears about its own citizens and indiscriminately proclaim them terrorists. And you don't negotiate with terrorists, you destroy them. And that is the basic outline of the primitive construction used by the Kievan authorities. It's primitive, but it's effective. And it's effective because you are covering up for that. And this is shameful. The situation in the southeast of Ukraine remains explosive. Kiev is not abiding by the ceasefire agreement. It's moved deep into the gray area, and this was confirmed by the presidential advisor, Mr. Berikov. It has reached the situation where in some areas the sides are very close to each other. It's very dangerous. The very recent reports of the special monitoring mission of the OSCE confirmed that new Ukrainian tanks and artillery have arrived in Donbass. Kiev is also not carrying out its political commitment. It's trying to marginalize the mechanism of the Minsk contact group and relaunch for a second round the discussion of issues which have already been agreed. Once again, this is being condoned by our Western partners, stating, as was done, for example, by Kurt Volker, that the proclaimed republics of Donbass is not something that has a place in Minsk agreements and that they have to disappear. And President Poroshenko states that the Minsk format does not exist. So what kind of a reaction from Donbass are you expect when you hear this kind of rhetoric? Because of such an encouragement by Western states to anything that Kiev does, there is an atmosphere of lawlessness, extremism, rabid nationalism rampant in the country. Hatred of Russia and any kind of dissent is being brutally suppressed. Kiev's lack of readiness to follow the standards of OSCE in the recent years is becoming increasingly obvious. And you are trying not to notice that. Partly because it's objectively difficult for you to make your way through the maze of this surreal Ukrainian domestic political life without interpretation and first-hand information. And you continue using the worn-out cliches about a democratic choice and the right for a bright future in the family of democratic countries, only sometimes very mildly scolding Kiev for the lack of progress in reform and fighting corruption. But in actual fact, and this is the most important, you intentionally overlook the flagrant violations of democratic or civilizational norms and the absolute anarchy of lawlessness and lies and the rising neo-Nazism. Very recently, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights received an official refusal from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine to certify the Russian observers in Ukrainian presidential elections. And the Minister of Internal Affairs, Mr. Avakov, promised that he will vet not just the Russians but all international observers using the extremist site Mirotvorets, the site which is banned in some countries. Let me tell for those who don't know, this site, in violation of existing rules about personal activities, provides personal data about people who are not liked by the Kiev nationalists. Some of them have been killed. This is basically putting black marks on people or compiling hit lists. If you think that only Russian citizens are in that list, let me tell you that the list includes personal data about politicians from UK, France, Germany, Italy, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And these steps by Kiev is yet another flagrant violation of international commitments, which at the same time is undermining ODIHR, which pretends to be the golden standard of monitoring elections. I would like to point out here that the decision of the Biden authorities not to open election polls in Russia resulted in millions of Ukrainians not having an opportunity to vote whilst in Russia. And this brings into question the transparency and objectivity of the upcoming elections. Of course, the people in Donbass will not have an opportunity to vote. That's 4 million people. In other words, 10% of the Ukrainian population, which is about 42 million people. So whom do you think these people would vote for, or rather will never vote for, these people who are citizens of Ukraine? Yes, the authorities in Kiev today who shed hypocritical fears about them are not needed by them. They cut them off in the course of their impure political games. Let me recall that Kiev, while trying to care for its citizens, installed economic, transport, energy, and social blockade of Donbass. I would like to hear from the Western mentors of Kiev who are in this room. I would like to hear their principal assessment of the democratic development in Ukraine. Of course, this has to include also the situation with religious freedoms in Ukraine. In Ukraine, where Orthodox churches are being openly seized with the support from the legislative and executive authorities. During the pre-election campaign, the Ukrainians forgot that in civilized countries, the state is separated from church, and that in Ukraine, this is something that's in the constitution. The existing authorities very shamelessly is trying to play the religious card, separating the faithful and flagrantly violating religious freedom. In conclusion, I would like to yet once again say very clearly that the key obstacle on resolving the crisis and normalizing life is in the absence of a clear reaction of Western countries to the lack of desire of Kiev to implement the package of measures, which is already 4 years old. In other words, what we're talking about here is sabotaging a Security Council Resolution 2202. As a result, Kiev is creating new adventurous provocations which can only worsen this situation. We would like to believe that the participants in the meeting today will send to the Ukrainian authorities an appeal to strictly abide by their international commitments. In Kiev, they have to understand that the implementation of the Minsk package of measures is the only chance for peace and settlement in Ukraine. And one more thing. We would like to warn everyone, Kiev and those who sponsor it, warn against hoping for a plan B. Especially if someone is under an illusion that there is a military way of resolving an inter-Ukrainian conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.